journey back is just as safe. I am Dr. Lynn LaValle, Vice Provost of Indigenous Engagement here at the University of Manitoba, and welcome to the Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series. We started this Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series this term to acknowledge the Indigenous scholars we have here at the University of Manitoba. A lot of people aren't aware, but we have just under 50 self-identified Indigenous scholars, and these scholars are asked to speak globally about their scholarship, and often not asked to speak within the institution. So we started the Scholar Speakers in order to acknowledge our own, and yes, I'm providing that ownership. And I don't know if people have seen Nahani Fontaine's comment about in the legislative building, right? But it is to honor our Indigenous scholars here, and I recognize that our can be problematic, but it is recognition by the Office of the Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement, and I think that's very important. And it started off with a lot of people present, and it's kept up, so clearly there's a need for this to happen. And I'm very glad you're here, and please spread the word. The speaker series will continue. It's every 2 weeks on a Thursday. The next talk and the final talk is 2 weeks from today in the same room, and that will be Dr. Fred Shore. I want to acknowledge the traditional territory that we're on. I'm a guest here, as well as being the land of my grandfather, who was from Swan Lake. We're gathered on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cariou, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. This talk is being live streamed on Facebook, and do we have anybody joining us yet? Yeah. We have one person, hi! So we're going to have a question and answer period afterwards, and the folks who are joining us on Facebook can type in their questions, and Nikita will translate that question to Dr. Cariou. So Dr. Warren Cariou was born and raised in Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, into a family of Métis and European heritage. He has published works of fiction, criticism, and memoir about Indigenous cultures and environmental issues in Canada. He is a professor of English and directs the Centre for Creative Writing and Oral Culture at the University of Manitoba. His talk today is called The Now Place, Indigenous Storytelling in the Contemporary World. Welcome, Dr. Cariou.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and it's a real honor to have an opportunity to speak to anyone who will listen about the stories that I've had the great privilege to hear and to think about over the years in my time here at U of M. I also just want to say Tanche and to acknowledge this territory. This is where my great-grandparents lived here in Red River, and a number of other relatives going further back. So when I moved here about 20 years ago, I had visited Winnipeg a couple of times, but I felt like there was a sense of home here, and I have really felt welcomed here at the university and in the community as well. I've also had the opportunity to bring Indigenous storytellers and elders, knowledge keepers from other territories to come here to share their stories, and I want to acknowledge them and thank them for all of the efforts that they have made to come and share stories with us here, and I'll talk about a couple of those today. So it's my responsibility to in a way reflect the learning that I have done over the years with these elders and storytellers, and it's a very happy responsibility. It's something that I'm proud to do, and I'm very glad to do whenever I have the opportunity. So thank you so much to the university for this opportunity. A long time ago, there was a little man, just the size of a boy, but he was a powerful Métis. And his name was Chakapish. Young Coyote was a full-grown man. He was the son of Old Coyote, and he's a full-grown man, and he's got a wife already. One day, Napi was walking along saying, Niktagai, what should I do? What should I do? Those are the beginnings of 3 oral stories, as I recall them. The first told by Omashkigo Cree elder Louis Bird, who is here on my first slide. And I'll show you another image of Louis Bird, whom I've had the opportunity, the honor to work with for about 12 years now. And he's from the Mushkego Cree community of Winnisk, Ontario. And he received an honorary doctorate here at the U of M about 1.5 years ago. And he says he still sleeps with the degree because he's so writers. And I think he deserves it very richly. The second story that I told you the very beginning of is by a Sioux Okanagan storyteller named Harry Robinson. And the Okanagan people are an interior Salish people in the interior of British Columbia, and they have an incredibly rich storytelling tradition. They also have a very rich relationship to their territory, which they've inhabited for thousands and thousands of years, and their stories come out of the land, according to the elders there. I'm going to tell you more about Harry Robinson in a bit. The third story that I told, my recollection of the first couple of sentences, was told by Kainai elder Flora Zaharia. So the Kainai Nation is in southern Alberta, but Flora Zaharia has lived here in Manitoba for many years, and she lives in Winnipeg, and we've had great opportunities to hear the stories, the Kainai people's stories, hear from her, and to talk about those stories with her, and she's a wonderful, wonderful storyteller. So all of those three stories that I gestured toward and I sort of opened for you at the very beginning are stories that would be categorized as mist of time stories. And by that I mean, I'm using a term that is I've learned from another elder, a really amazing elder that I've been working with a lot lately, and that is Rocky Cree elder and storyteller and many other things, educator William Dumas. And so this is a picture of him in his what I call his storytelling seat, because he loves to tell stories while he's driving. And I've had the opportunity to sit in the listening seat quite a few times, and it's a wonderful thing. And he's a philosopher of stories as well, I think. And his idea is that thinking about these stories that are from long, long ago, stories that are from before recorded history maybe, or before contact, if you want to call it that, stories that contain so much wisdom that's been accumulated over the centuries in a particular oral culture, a particular nation. William has said we should call these mist of time stories. What they tended to be called in English is legends or myths. And William objects to that, and I think a lot of other elders have as well, but I think he's come up with a really great term to suggest something different. Because the word legends, to me, sort of connotes a quaint story from long ago, but one that's sort of not that interesting anymore, or a story that has been sort of an artifact. It's a dusty old story, and it isn't relevant to our present day. When the oral stories that our storytellers continue to tell today are anything but that. They're incredibly vibrant, they're incredibly contemporary, and they have a kind of magic in the way that they knit together our contemporary moment with the time of our ancestors. And so that's what I want to talk about today, really a small topic, time and space, in Indigenous stories. Because stories tend to get thought of as legends in English, I think they've been sort of overlooked in a lot of ways. And our contemporary world, we don't value some of the skills that are required to really understand a story in a deep way. So we've sort of lost the ability to listen carefully. I think people try, but it's hard to listen without taking notes, for example. And in a way, I think we've shifted our attention toward Indigenous literature when we're thinking about Indigenous culture. And I am a scholar of Indigenous literature. I love the books written by my fellow Indigenous writers from across Turtle Island. And those books are getting all kinds of attention these days. In fact, most critics that I've talked to lately would say that the most vibrant literature in North America, certainly in Canada, is from our Indigenous writers. And I am so thrilled that that is the case, and I celebrate their writing. But at the same time, I want to give a little more attention to the storytellers who are really not getting the attention that they deserve. Most of them are humble people who don't want attention, but the stories deserve attention. And I think we need to think about how oral stories are a little different from written stories. And I think the writers, who are so celebrated these days, our Indigenous writers, would also agree with me that many of their books are really based on oral traditions as well. And I think they would also agree, and certainly ones that I've talked to have said this, the storytellers and the oral stories need more attention. So that's the work that I do, that I like to focus on the story as a told experience, rather than as a written down thing, or even as a recorded thing. Now, of course, all humans tell stories is not exclusively an Indigenous trait, but for Indigenous cultures, the ones that I'm familiar with, oral stories are incredibly important. They are where the knowledge is kept alive and where it is passed on to the next generation. And each Indigenous oral story, sometimes it may even be a very short story, can contain enormous amounts of cultural knowledge, very practical knowledge of how to survive on the land, philosophy, linguistic traces of past stories, all kinds of things. You just look into one story, you can find so much. And you can learn that somewhat by looking at the written down versions as well. But what I'd like to do is think about what changes, what is different about a story when you're there in the presence of the storyteller and you're relating to that person. And it's different from theater as well. In theater, you have the actor up on a stage and the audience is down below. And you don't have an eye-to-eye relationship. And in storytelling, that is crucial, that relationship where you are in the circle together. And that's a relational element of storytelling that I think is crucial. And one of the most famous Indigenous writers, Thomas King, has very famously said in his book, The Truth About Stories, he has said, the truth about stories is that's all we are. And I fully agree with that. But every time I see that quoted, I want to add a little something to it, to, I guess, oralize it a little bit more. What I would like to say, to get a little asterisk there with Thomas King, is the truth about stories is that that's all we are in relation. Because to me, stories are engines of relationship. They are how we connect to one another, how we tell one another where we're from, and understand our relationships. And if you notice, Indigenous people, when they meet, they'll, one of the first things they'll ask is, where are you from? And then it usually goes from there to the stories of where you're from. And the stories are often about connecting. And in a way, to me, I think Indigenous oral stories, that is their primary function, is connecting people, making community, making relationship. And they thrive in that medium of relationship. So that's the primary thing I think the stories do. And they're also mysterious in a lot of ways. And the more I've tried to study them, the more I've come up against these mysteries, in a sense. You can never really be sure exactly where the oral story is. Unlike a written down story, you can just find the text and you say, okay, there it is, I know that's page 21 of this text. With an oral story, it's different because each time the story is told, there will be some changes. The storyteller will adapt it to the new situation, the new group of people that he's telling the story to or she's telling the story to. And at first I wasn't too bothered by that, but I started thinking about this as a scholar of stories, and I thought, okay, I want to write something about the Cree rolling head story, for example. Well, then I started looking around and listening and asking people about the rolling head story, and I heard about 25 different versions of that story. And I started thinking, which one should I write about? And it really was a lesson for me to realize that oral stories don't have an authoritative version. That's the point of oral stories, actually. There's not one single version that's right and others that are wrong. All of them are part of the story. They're multiple, they're fluid, they're always open to new tellings, new rememberings, and new listenings. And so I think that's a really, people within a Western perspective tend to think about stories as being fragile, right? They might be forgotten, they might be lost. But when we look at it from an Indigenous perspective, we can see the stories are flexible. And that is something that Western culture doesn't do well, right? So the flexibility, the fluidity of the stories, I think, is a crucial element of them. And I think, hopefully, everyone would agree with me that when you hear an oral story, magic of a certain kind happens. And anyone who's told a story to a child, or been a child and had a story told to them, will recognize there's something transporting about an oral story, where you are taken into a different time and place and character, at the same time as you recognize you're still having a relationship with the person who's telling it to you. There's something extraordinary about that experience, and I've seen this again and again, watched other people listening to storytellers and seen the magic in their eyes, and I've just experienced it myself when I've been sort of enraptured by a storyteller's performance. One other thing to note about stories, I want to get onto some specific examples momentarily here. But to me, one other thing about a story is that it's not really a thing. You can't pin it down. And that's actually a strength of the story, I think. In a sense, a story is not a thing, but it's an experience. It's a process. And it's a form of energy. It might even be a spirit, if you want to think of it that way. And so that explains, in a sense, how stories can be so fluid and how they can be multiple. And one of the other crucial things about a story is that because it's not really a thing, it can't be commodified, at least in my view. A story can be written down and turned into a book which can be sold, or can be made into a movie which can be sold. But the story itself, the oral story, I don't think that can be sold. I think it is the relationship that the teller and the listeners have. That's the story. And that can't be sold. That is fundamentally a gift. That is my theory that I'm trying to work out in my research. So stories are gifts. So I want to talk about time and space in relation to these stories, and I want to talk about two stories in particular. I hope I'll have time to go into a little bit of detail in both of these stories. So the first story that I want to talk about is not a mist of time story. This is a different kind of story. This is told by Dubby Thomason, who was our writer-storyteller in residence here at the Center for Creative Writing and Oral Culture at the U of M in January of 2015. So Dubby has ancestry in the Kiowa Apache side of her family and on the Lakota side of her family as well. And she is now a renowned storyteller, and she tells Mist of Time stories from both of those cultural traditions in her heritage. But she also tells, I guess, stories that are based on history or based on personal experience. And this story that I would like to play a brief clip from today is the one that she told as a way of introducing herself when she first arrived as our storyteller in residence in 2015. So this story is called My Name is Dubby. And her name is really the crucial part of the story. And the clip I'm going to play is very much about that. Just to give you an understanding of what's happening in the earlier part of the story, Dubby talks about her unusual name, how kids, when she was growing up, were asking her, why are you called that? What does that mean? How even when she was in school, one of the teachers decided that wasn't a real name and decided to just give her a different name. And then her father found out about that and went and had talking with the teacher, and she was Dubby at school again. But one of the interesting things about that is that in this entire time as a child, having been named legally Dubby Thomason, she was never called that at home. Dubby was not ever used in relation to her when she was at home. And the reason for that was that her grandmother was Dubby. And there was an understanding in the family that there could only be one Dubby at a time in the family. And so this is in the background of the story. And now I want to just play this brief 2-minute clip of the story. This is now when Dubby she's grown up, she's moved away from home, she's working, and she receives a phone call from her father.
That's who my grandma had been. After she passed, my dad gave me a picture of her. I knew she'd passed because when he called me far away, calling me from Texas, where I was somewhere on the East Coast, he called me and he said, Dubby. First time he'd ever called me by his mama's name. You see, we followed that tradition that so many people do, not only in our Indigenous traditions, but globally. I've met people who in their culture will only have one person carrying a name in a lifetime. While my grandma was alive, she was Dubby. I couldn't be Dubby while yet she breathed, but she made sure I got that name. Maybe she'd seen so much pass away. She wanted to be sure that name carried on. And so after Dad gave me this news, as only my dad could without telling me, he sent me a picture of Grandma. In that picture, she was younger than me. She was younger than I could imagine her ever being. And her hair was done in some fancy early 20th century, late 19th century thing with pins and clips and twists. And she was wearing an elegant dress with a big wide sash. I could see it was an important dress. And important event, and it was her last day at the school, her graduation. After 4 years now, she was ready for a career working in someone else's house as a housekeeper. On the back it said simply, Dove, Lawton, Oklahoma. That's my grandma, my best friend, my first and greatest teacher.
Just want to thank Debbie Thomason for giving me permission to share that with you today. I get choked up every time I listen to this story. It's a story about naming, as I said, and I think if we think about names as the most condensed kind of story that you could possibly have, then it can help us to understand something about the temporality of oral stories and the way in which tradition connects to the present day. It's as if for her whole life, Dovey, who has not been called that at home, has been in training to become Dovey. And what we have left out of this clip of the story is where she talks about having spent time with her grandmother, learning the stories that her grandmother remembered from her own childhood and from having met other Indigenous people who told her stories. So her apprenticeship as a storyteller has been her whole childhood. But she isn't really taking the role of the storyteller or the story keeper or the knowledge keeper until she hears her father speak that name. Suddenly, now, she is Dovey. And in a powerful way, she is faced with not only the grief at the loss of her grandmother, but also with the sense that maybe she's not prepared enough to be the storyteller. Maybe she doesn't know enough. Maybe she doesn't remember well enough to be the story keeper in the family. And so the rest of the story is really her trying to work out how can she live up to the level of knowledge that her grandmother had. How can she keep those stories alive in the next generation? But to me, I think this sense of responsibility is one that everyone who hears a story probably should feel to a certain degree. That we're supposed to take those with us, we're supposed to think about them and make them part of our present lives. Some of the stories that we will hear if you talk to an elder, a Mist of Time story may be thousands of years old. It may have been gathering information and knowledge over all that time. And we may not be able to remember them perfectly, but I think we do have a responsibility to remember and to think about them. For her, she feels that the past suddenly lands in her lap in a way. She now is her grandmother in a way, but she feels like she doesn't know how to do that, how to be that great matriarch. And so she tries to work her way through that. And one of the complications of this in the story is that, as you'll notice, her father, right after he speaks that name to her, he sends a photograph to her. A photograph of her grandmother. And of course, photographs as the sort of quintessential Western technology of freezing a moment in time. And that photograph presents to Dovey her grandmother younger than she could even imagine her, younger than Dovey herself is at that time. So there's a strange kind of cyclical quality of time that's being invoked there. And also, this photograph is not just any old photograph that was taken at a particular moment in her grandmother's life. It was taken when she finished residential school. And that is crucial. It's sort of understated in the story. But this is a moment where her grandmother is dressed up and is turned out as a young lady to take on a job. And you'll notice Dovey's response to the job is work in someone else's house. So she has been educated in the Western way, but she still maintained the stories. And this is the crucial part of My Name is Dovey, is that even though her grandmother was in the boarding school and had lost some of her language and lost some of the stories, she maintained enough of them. She maintained a lot of memory, and she was able to tell those to Dovey as well. So this moment in the story is, we see that the photograph, and it's invoking trauma. It's invoking loss, and it's invoking the government's attempt to remove that culture. But at the same time, the story becomes a celebration that the stories themselves persist, despite colonialism, despite various efforts to end that transmission of the stories. Western views of orality tend to think about orality as being transient, untrustworthy, not lasting. But I think when you listen to a lot of oral stories, they demonstrate the opposite of that. Oral stories are persistent. Oral stories are strong, and partly because of their flexibility and fluidity, they're able to have that energy to pass on to the next generations. And so My Name is Dubby is a celebration of how stories find a way to inhabit us and to give us the impetus to make more relations and to pass those stories on to the next generation. So in a way, when she tells those stories now, she is remembering her grandmother, and she is participating in a deep time that her community, both Lakota and Kiowa Apache communities, have developed and have held together for centuries. So the other story that I want to tell you about is one by Harry Robinson, whom I introduced to you briefly at the beginning. And this one is a Mist of Time story. And I've had to choose a Mist of Time story that actually is not going to be presented to you in a recording. And the reason for that is that Mist of Time stories usually have particular protocols attached to them. That certain situations there can be told, or by a certain teller they can be told. But I don't have the permission, and I wouldn't really ask for the permission, to just broadcast those stories on the internet. So when I realized that this is going to be live streamed, I had to change my tactics a little bit, and I'm focusing on a story that's written down. That is a version of an oral story that's written down, because this one is there in the public already, so I'm not going to be as concerned about being disrespectful to the story. So, the story is called Cariou Plays a Dirty Trick, and it's in Harry Robinson's book, Write It On Your Heart. I'll give you some citations for these later if you're interested. These stories were told in relationship. This non-Indigenous anthropologist, Wendy Wickwire, developed a strong friendship, a relationship with Harry Robinson, and got to know his culture really well, and eventually he wanted to share his stories with her, and they agreed to turn them into a series of books. And so Write It On Your Heart is the first one of those books. And these stories, one of the things I really love about them is the way that Wendy Wickwire has maintain the oral qualities of the stories. And I'll show you a text version of it, and you'll maybe get a sense of what I mean by that. This is a sort of interjection in the story, and I'm going to talk about what it means in a minute. You'll see that there are repetitions in the text. There are circularities, and Harry Robinson's first language was not English, and so there's part of his accent is there as well. And she's kept all of that. When someone, anthropologists of previous era, would interview Indigenous elders and hear some stories, what they would tend to do is take all that stuff out and turn it into basically, I guess, what we think of now as legends. When all the oral aspects are taken out, all the relational aspects are taken out, and then that's why they're boring, right? They don't have the relation, they don't have the energy in them. But Wendy Wickwire's versions, to me, do retain some of that energy. It's not the same as hearing a story directly from the storyteller, or even listening to a recording of it, but it is, I think, an interesting and useful representation of the story. So in this story, the Okanagan people, as I think I mentioned earlier, they have a very rich tradition of coyote stories. Dozens, hundreds of coyote stories, and these have been actually written down by different Okanagan writers over the generations. And Mourning Dove, one of the early Indigenous writers in Canada, wrote coyote stories as well. So, but this version, I'm just going to talk about the one that Harry told to Wendy Wickwire in the late 1970s. And the story is that Old Coyote has a son, and the son has already gotten married and has a family. But Old Coyote decides that he's going to trick his son. And so he builds a tree, an incredibly high tree with his powers, because Coyote has medicine powers. And then he says to his son, climb up that tree because we need some feathers. We need eagle feathers, and there's some eagles up there. So climb up there. I'm too old, I can't do it, but if you climb up, I'll use my powers to be sure you don't fall out. And so young Coyote listens to his dad. He climbs the tree, keeps climbing. This is a very tall tree. Keeps climbing and climbing and climbing. And looks down. Eventually, he can't even see the ground anymore. but he doesn't have anywhere else to go, so he keeps climbing up. And then finally he sees there's a little ledge of ground, and he jumps off onto that. But he realizes he's not where he was before. There's something strange about this. And he starts to look around, and eventually he realizes he's on the moon. So this tree has been so high, and his father has sort of tricked him into climbing to the moon. And so young Coyote has a series of adventures up there on the moon. And we'll get into those in a minute. But in the middle of that, as Harry Robinson is telling the story, he has this little aside, which I think is fascinating, where he talks about Neil Armstrong. And he gets a piece of paper, he says, I've got it written on paper here, and it says the first man that's on the moon, that's Armstrong. He was the first man on the moon. But they did not know Coyote's son was the first man on the moon. Right, so now we have this new movie about Neil Armstrong. I really think there should be one about young Coyote and his heroic travel to the moon. And so I find this very interesting that he would do this. And I think this is, again, where an editor would just take that out. Because this is, if you were thinking this from a Western perspective, you might think, well, that's a contamination of the purity of this story. Right? It's not the old part. But the new parts are crucial because they tie the story in to the present moment. So this is in the late 70s. It's less than 10 years after the moon landing. So when it's still pretty fresh in people's minds that they're having this storytelling session. And so Harry Robinson wants to tie that in. And he's very aware of the contemporary world. He's not a storyteller who just lives in the past. He lives in this world. And he has things to say about like colonial notions of being there first, for example, right? So what he's suggesting here is, if the Americans ever want to claim the moon, well, young Coyote was there first, so they don't have that first contact. And then actually, as young Coyote discovers as he wanders around the moon, he's not the only one there either. There are other people who live there. There are beings who are sometimes poplar trees and then sometimes become human, and they change their form, and he talks to them, and he travels with them for a while. And then he meets an old couple who seem to be sort of human, but then at other times they're spiders. And they are, in a sense, and there's a whole lot of spider stories in the Okanagan tradition as well. So these are not just your everyday spiders, these are very powerful beings as well. And he learns from them. One of the things he learns is how to make a basket for himself. And the other thing he learns is how to make a long, long, long rope. And he's able to use these teachings to finally get himself into a basket and lower himself slowly, slowly back down to where he came from. And so his father, in the meanwhile, has thought his son never coming back. And the father had done that because he had taken a liking to his son's wife. And so that was what he had done this for. This is why it's a dirty trick, one of the reasons. But young Coyote manages to get back down to earth. And this is what happens in the story when he does that. He jumps out of the basket, and this is what he says. That's this place, the storyteller says. That's this place right here. That was in Lytton. That's in Lytton. Then young Coyote, he says, now this is my country. This is my place. And they come out from that basket, because some of the tree people had come along with him. And young Coyote, he walked, and there's supposed to be rock. It's supposed to be bedrock. Looks like a bedrock. Flat, right on the ground. He walked there. And now today, if anybody know where that is, they could still see the tracks that was marked on that rock. So, young Coyote's journey and his return to his place, marking the place where his people are, even though the people don't really even exist yet at this point in the storytelling cycle. For the Okanagan listeners, they'll know that. They'll know that place, right? And this is such a common feature of Mist of Time stories in many different Indigenous traditions, where a place on the landscape is associated with something that happened in the oral tradition. So there are many examples of this in the Cree stories in northern Manitoba, for example. We'll talk about that if there's time. So yes, the young Coyote's footprints are registered there on the land. And he said, if anyone goes there, you can see them. He said, you can see them now. I'll show you. And he talks in another part of the story, talks to Linda Whitmire about that. However, as he's telling that, he goes back to another time. And this is a historic time period now. It's not the moment where they're speaking. It's not Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. This is in the 1890s or so, or early part of the 20th century. And this is when the CPR is coming through. the railway is coming through, and it just so happens that the surveyors on the railway want to put their track right over Coyote's footprints. So he tells about that time. And so he says what the Okanagan people say to the surveyors, which I think is a very interesting way of saying this. Looks like your surveying line, your line is right on our history. Your line is right on our history. When you think about the history of colonial borders on Turtle Island, that's something that a lot of Indigenous people can identify with. These lines get put on their history. And often the lines have violent effects, either by, in this case, when you put a railway through in the mountains, you blow things up, right? It would actually destroy the footprints because they would need to blast through. But these people, they go to the surveyors and say, your line's on our history. Please move your line. And so they decide, and the surveyors actually agree to come along with them. And so they go up and they say, okay, we're going to show you these footprints, and then you'll know what we mean. But they go up there, the footprints can't be seen now. But they were just there, and they know this is the right spot. Why are the footprints no longer visible? So they start thinking about that. And the answer that they come up with is, we've brought these people who don't understand. They don't understand, and their lack of understanding or their lack of desire to understand is actually infecting everyone, so nobody can see them now. Right? So this is a very powerful, interesting representation of colonial ideology and how it sort of spread in unexpected ways. So they're now, what are they going to do now? They have, they were going to show the tracks, and they thought that would convince these surveyors to go somewhere else, but now they can't see them. So they decide, well, they're going to tell them the story. Why not? Nothing else is working. So they decide they're going to tell them the story. And Harry Robbins is very careful about how he says this. So they told them all about it. And they told them just a part of the story. Not all, just a part of that story. So you can tell that there are, from what he's saying here, that there are parts of the story which are not meant to be shared with people from outside of the community. And including Wendy Wickwire, whom he's telling the story to. Right? This is a version that's told for her. So there are parts that are not here in this text. And he's saying that they're very careful about their protocols. They know what parts can be told and what can't. And as they tell it, they say again to these people, we want you to miss it. You can work your surveying from up somewhere and not hit this part. If you miss them, it'll be better. So they tell the story. And it works. The surveyors actually listen to the story. They are moved by it, and they decide, okay, we're going to move our line. That is a huge victory, and it's one that is very rare in the interactions between traditional people and surveyors and politicians from the Western world. In fact, there are many cases where, for example, the Mistassini stone, or sacred stone in southern Saskatchewan, was blown up with dynamite to make way for the Gardiner Dam. So all the stories that were connected with that stone were exploded, right? In northern Manitoba, we have Wissahickit's chair, where Wissahickit is said to have sat down on the rock, and you can see it in the rock. Manitoba Hydro flooded that. So there are many cases of that happening in Turtle Island. But this one is a victory. They actually convinced them, and it's because of the story. The story convinces these people, even though they don't really understand the full context of it. And it's the belief that the Okanagan people have in the story that I think helps to make it have that effect. So, in a sense, the story has a persistence, but there's more to it than that. It's still complicated, and I'll show you one more. Oh, I guess this is the last slide that I want to point to. Even though the story convinces them, then when the Okanagan people go back to that place later, it's still a sacred place, but some of them can't see the story, can't see the footprints. But as Harry Robinson says, some can. Some people are still able to. And I think this is an interesting comment on our ability to hear the stories as well, and our ability to maybe believe in the stories enough so that we can actually see how the stories have structured our land and our relationship to the land. So he says here, some can see it. Some have lost the ability to see it. But the stories And the footsteps actually have persisted if you know how to look, if you know how to listen. And he's actually said earlier in the story to Wendy Wickwire, he knows where they are. He's seen them. So he, in this present generation, has been able to see them, and he says, I'll go and show you. He's not sure, I guess, whether she'll actually be able to see them because she's not Okanagan. But even so, even after the ideologies of colonialism have suffused and changed things, the stories persist. They have a strength much beyond what Western culture may have thought that they had. So, to me, the stories, oral stories in general, are like those footprints. They make an impression on us, and we may or may not remember them. We may or may not come back to them and think about them having an impact on us. But if you know how to listen, if you know how to approach them with a humble heart, and recognizing that you're never going to master them maybe, but that you just want to learn from them, they'll stay there with you. And I've had this happen time and again, actually, where I've had the opportunity to talk to elders more than once over a longer period of time. And Louis Bird is an elder I've talked to many times. And so very often I'm just visiting with Louis, and he'll mention a story that I've heard from him several times. He'll mention something about it, and even just with a few words, he can bring out a teaching in that story that I hadn't known was there. A significance that's there in the metaphors of that story. And so sometimes, you just need to be reminded to think about that story and to actually realize that in different stages in your life, a story will mean different things to you. This is something that Louis Bird tells very often. He says there are 5 stages in life of appreciating a story. And so a different version of the story will be told to people at different ages. And he says they get funnier and funnier as you get older. He says the elders know the funniest versions. They have the sort of secret knowledge that they can see, and that they can get not only the funny parts, but also the deepest teachings out of those stories. And so recognizing that learning the stories is not a matter of just memorizing it once or hearing it once, but it's a lifelong commitment. It's a lifelong relationship that you can have with a story. And you may forget it for decades, and it may come back to you and bring you something that you really needed to know that can help you in your life. And I really think that oral stories help us to do that because we remember relationships. Human beings are programmed to remember relationships. And so sometimes we may not remember, something that happened in a book we read, but you might remember being in a place where a storyteller or an elder told you something important. And all the sensory aspect of that encounter, what the room was like, what the light was, the sounds in the background, all of that is part of your experience, and you can actually tap into that with your memory. And for me, this is one of the crucial things when we think about what are the importance of oral stories in the world today. When there's so many other distractions, there's so many other things that we can spend our time on. And of course, we can use technologies to record oral stories. So sometimes people think, well, if I've got it recorded, then we're good. I can just go back and listen to that recording. But it's not the same thing as actually experiencing it in a relational way. And I think that's really something that we can learn more from, that we can value more from. Now, teaching is part of that. Teaching is relational as well. And so I like to think about teaching in relation to storytelling. And I've been fortunate to be able to bring storytellers into my classes fairly often. And I think the students really have benefited from that and really enjoyed that. And I think the storytellers have really enjoyed that as well. So I wanted to thank U of M for making that possible as well through the support that I've received over the years in my career. One last thing I wanted to gesture toward here at the end is thinking about other ways that stories can be told and listened to. We're in a time now of Indigenous cultural resurgence, of vitality. We have a lot of our communities across Turtle Island are taking real initiative to keep their languages vital, right? To be sure that the younger generations speak their languages and to be sure that they know the stories. And there's all kinds of really fascinating things going on in different land-based language camps and story camps that are happening. I just want to play an image from one place that I visited 3 years ago. This is the Powermaker First Nation in Saskatchewan. This is quite close to my hometown of Meadow Lake. And my friend Floyd Favel there is an extraordinary, I guess, impresario of storytelling, I call him. And he organized this storytelling of the Powermaker First Nations sacred story of creation. And this story was told within ceremony in a lodge on the land, as you see. But this photograph was taken before we began that part, because within ceremony we're not to be taking photographs. In fact, I'm not to be talk about that story and what the story was really. But Floyd has mentioned that I can say it's okay to talk about the experience. And for us to be there, for me, with members from the community and people who had traveled from long distances to hear these stories, they're on the land in a traditional way. We were there for 8 or 9 hours in the lodge, just hearing the stories. And that was a profound experience. There was something about being there on the land in Powermaker territory and hearing those stories, those old stories resonating with a new generation of young people as well. That was so empowering for the youth and the other folks that were there, and for me to just witness that and to see this is happening in communities all over Turtle Island now. Right? This is something that I think there's more and more energy for and interest in. And for me, as a scholar, this is something I want to help out however I can. So if you have ideas or if you know of communities that are interested in doing this, come and talk to me, and I may be able to help out in some way or point you to the right direction to find someone else who can help. Because I think this is the future of stories in a way. Stories can be told in classrooms, and they can be very powerful in that way as well. But I think there's something particularly empowering about having stories on the land. And in fact, this is actually my dream, would be one day to have a storytelling place that was here somewhere. Not too far from campus maybe. We actually have some forest left, a little cabin in the woods where we could all gather and listen to the stories. That would be my ultimate dream to do here at U of M. But I think somewhere in Winnipeg, I think it would be great to have something like that. So with that, I will close. I'll just leave you with my laughing elder Louis Bird here and some suggestions if you want further information. And Dovey Thomason's story, My Name is Dovey, I've got a note there. If you'd like to watch the whole thing, it's available on Vimeo. If you could just Google My Name is Dovey, the video will come up and you can just listen to the whole thing. It's about 20 minutes long. So with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Any questions, comments?
Haley, yeah.
I really appreciate what you were saying. A word that you didn't use, but that I found really implicit in My Name is Dovey. To me, that was a story about transmission.
Mm-hmm.
Transmission of wisdom from one to the next. And I think Western culture loses that sense, at least in a ceremonial way or a ritual way, of transmission occurring. Yeah, I'm dad, I teach my kids something, I'll teach their kids. And
Can
maybe
you folks hear in the back? Can people hear? I can't really hear you. So you're having a conversation with just
sorry.
the two of you. Sorry.
You want me to?
Or just
Yeah.
speak louder.
If you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry about that, I forgot. I was saying to Warren that in the story, My Name is Dovey, a word that I didn't hear him mention, but to me was implicit, is this notion of transmission, of wisdom and knowledge from one generation to the next. And I think in Western culture, we've lost that. And I was saying that, a dad will say, yeah, I teach my son, I teach my daughter, and they learn stuff from me. And maybe if I'm still around and we're in the same city, I'll teach my grandkids. But this was really implicit, I found in the culture and the elaborate way that Dovey's father went about it. The other thing that really struck me about that story was that in school, they didn't want to call her Dovey, called her something else. And that's really a powerful way of saying they took my name, they took our name away. We weren't who we were. I think story makes that so clear. So, Chimigwich.
No, thank you. Yes. So just for those who are maybe listening on the live stream, the comment about transmission, I think is such a good way of thinking about what that story, My Name is Nabi, is about. And as you said, in Western culture, because it's so attached to the book, there's less I guess, emphasis on the personal nature of transmission of culture. Right? It's go read the book and you can learn about certain aspects of culture. But within an oral culture, it's a relational thing. And so the transmission is personal and it's personalized. So for each learner, that is crucial. Who they are is taken into account. And then as they remember, they're remembering in a personal way as well. So for Davi, she's remembering the stories as they were told to her by her grandmother. And then when she tells the stories, I've seen her, she actually sort of, it's as if, when she's telling a story, everyone in the room starts to become like a relative, and then she really welcomes that because she's building relationships as she's telling the story. So that is, I think, the nature of story is that, transmission of information, but more so of relationship, I would say. Or I guess a combination of the two. And yes, that is something that we have not given enough attention to, I think, within the university and in other aspects of our contemporary culture.
Thank you. So question back here, yes.
I was going to ask, like, if you go to other places in the West, do you deal with discrimination against the stories you tell them?
Very good question. Yeah, so when I travel, do I deal with discrimination against these stories? I guess in some ways the form of discrimination that's often directed toward oral stories is that they're just dismissed. There's like those are old, those are or sometimes they're dismissed by people saying, oh, those are just for kids, which I think is that's a really problematic thing to say, because we should be teaching the most important things to our kids, and that's what Indigenous oral stories do when the ones that are directed toward kids. So I think instead of a sort of direct attacks on the oral stories, most of the time people just want to ignore them, or say that that's just hearsay, or that's not important knowledge. So that is something that I've had to have that sort of work against that bias even within the academy sometimes, and it takes some doing, but I think it's work that's just so important and so necessary. People need to understand that oral stories have a way of relating knowledge that is different and that is not inferior to how text or other media work. And so that's something I've been really dedicated to, and I think people are starting to understand that. And certainly, scholars in Indigenous literature who mostly focus on the written word, they're very attuned to the oral aspects of those stories as well. So I think I don't have any trouble with my colleagues in Indigenous literature. It's just sort of, when you go a little broader, sometimes people think, oh, those are not important stories. But when I can provide examples and show how important they are and how much they affect us emotionally, I think that's also a really crucial part of it. My Name is Nabi, that story is such a powerful story emotionally. I've had any book that I've read, I've had emotional responses to nowhere near as I have to that story. And in fact, that story, it's not a spoiler, I guess, but to tell you that by the end of that story, there was 100 people in the room. Basically, everyone is weeping openly, right? And we were not embarrassed by that because the story stirred something crucial in us. And so I think when people can see that, they see there's no way you could say that's not important when it has that impact on it. So yeah, thanks, very important question.
Other question? I've got one. We have a bit of time.
Sure.
I'll come here just so folks
Sure.
here, but no, we can check.
Okay.
He's close. It's
Okay.
not. It's not like it's hot in here.
Yeah.
We're doing hot yoga. So when you were talking about the storytelling, I was thinking about how people are using storytelling as an Indigenous methodology in research, right? And a lot of doctoral students, master students, Indigenous people. And then when you talked about storytelling being relational, so if I'm a student and I'm a researcher, or I'm a researcher as a professor, and I say I'm doing storytelling, and then I have to write it down too, right? But it's relational and it's you and I. And then I have to somehow translate that. It's almost appropriation of the storytelling, I was just thinking. So what are your comments about that when people are using, and like we know about narrative inquiry, which is more of a Western perspective, but is storytelling really appropriate to use as an Indigenous methodology for research?
That's a great question, big question.
Sorry.
Yes, I think when you're dealing with, what are, William Dumas calls missed up time stories, those stories that are foundational to a culture, that are, that will often have protocols attached to them, you need to just have extra care with those. But I would say that thinking about Indigenous storytelling as a methodology of research, absolutely, I think that's a very viable and, in fact, a really appropriate method of research. And in fact, for me, I've been trying to think about, what is research from an Indigenous perspective? What does that mean? And in a way, visiting, what I call visiting is going talking to the knowledge keepers, go talk to someone who's in the community. That's research. If I could just, convince the granting agencies that visiting is research, I think that would be a big step forward, because it is relational. And I think research is too, but we've been taught in the Western Academy to think about research as being impersonal, right? We have this scientific model that says you don't want to have bias, and I understand the reason for that. But when the stories are being told, it's inherently relational, and so I think you need to honor that. But yes, as a research methodology, I think if you're working with knowledge keepers who are telling traditional stories, then it's really up to you as a researcher to be sure that you ask the elder and say, what is appropriate for me to put in my dissertation, or what is appropriate for me to put in my paper, what should I not? It's different depending on the communities, and it is the kind of thing where we still, as a university, we still need to work this out as well, because I know there are cases in other universities where a PhD student or a master's student want to put some traditional stories in their thesis, and then the thesis gets posted automatically online, and there's some concerns about that. And I think this is something each university needs to work out. What is the appropriate protocol for that? So each is different, and this is sort of the nature of oral cultures, is that there's not going to be one firm rule that will work outside of each individual context. So, but I think the fundamental rule is being coming with a humble heart and being respectful, and then just asking the elders. It doesn't hurt to ask if you're not sure. I think it's much better to ask than to just assume anything in that kind of situation. But to me, I think the knowledge to be gained is so crucial, and the relational aspect of thinking about what research is so crucial to actually the process of indigenizing the university itself. If we can start to have the university broadly, or our research funders recognize that visiting is research, that storytelling is research, then I think we've made a good step toward indigenizing the way education works in this country.
Any other questions? No, hearing none. Any on, please? How many viewers did we get?
Something like 60
60.
Holy man.
already, yeah. It'll
Much,
grow.
Thank you. I apologize about the heat, but I didn't do my HVAC training today.